Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Well, hello, and welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Glenn Branch. That name is not, I suspect, familiar to, well, it depends on the household, but Glenn is make sure I get this correct, is the Deputy Director of the NCSE, the National Center for Science Education. And let's do a little bio piece at the beginning. So you are the Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education. How did you get there? Like, why are you a mad scientist who's spending his years monitoring science? How'd they get to this position?
They all said I was mad at the university. No, I had been doing a PhD program in philosophy at UCLA and got bored with it. Moved with my wife up to the Bay Area in 1998 and was at loose ends and decided to volunteer at NCSC and came there as a volunteer, made myself indispensable as one does, and 22 years later, here I am.
And just to sort it out in my mind, so you were in a doctoral program or a graduate program for philosophy, yes?
That's right.
And your undergraduate degree was in?
Also in philosophy.
Also in philosophy. And did you have a particular interest in science or a general interest in science?
I had a general interest in science. I did not take a lot of science courses in college, however. Before that, though, I actually had an interest in what you might call pseudoscience, having read Martin Gardner's classic Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science while I was in high school and being quite impressed with it. In graduate school, I didn't do a lot of philosophy of science, which is relevant to pseudoscience, but I did some. And I was aware well before starting at NCSE that creationism was a threat to the integrity of science education in the United States and knew something about it. And volunteering at NCSC and then becoming employed by it was a fairly natural fit for me, given those interests.
So I think I read someplace that NCSC was started in some ways because of the push towards creationism, right? I mean, is that, or did it have its origins elsewhere?
No, that's right. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a spate of bills in legislatures around the country calling for equal time for something called creation science with evolution. And there was a loose-knit network of organizations called committees of correspondence after the committees in pre-Revolutionary War colonies that were organized to combat these bills. And the people who were running these committees of correspondence saw a need for there to be a national clearinghouse to coordinate their activities. And that's how NCSE was formed in 1982.
So it started to address the, for lack of a better term, we'll call it the sort of the attack on evolution as the only theory out there. But it then grew and to sort of, because I know that there are three at least stated prongs of work of the center. One being supporting teachers, another being blocking threats to science education, but investigating the terrain of science education as well. And so that, I'm assuming that came after the okay, we've got to do this thing about creationism. Yeah.
So the blocking the threats or catalyzing action, as I think it says on the website, has been at the core of NCSC's activities all this time. And that really is helping people and communities that are facing local challenges to the integrity of science education.
Hmm.
But as NCSC's first executive director, Eugenie Scott, put it, that's putting out brush fires. But beyond putting out brush fires, we want to do work clearing the brush. And that involves equipping teachers to be able to confidently and effectively teach socially, though not scientifically controversial topics like evolution.
Hmm.
And it also, if you want to do anything about the brush, you have to know where it is. So mapping the terrain through
Mapping the
investigating
terrain.
science education.
Right. And that is an ongoing process. Yes.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Um, we are nearing the 100th year of controversies over the teaching of evolution in American public education. So this is not a new problem, although it's changed a lot over the years.
Yeah. So it's not simply the looking for, or looking into things that either do keep us up all night or ought to keep us up all night. I know right now it's there's a lot of attention on how is climate science taught. So could you talk some about that in particular, and if there are other things in the category or sort of on the watch list that are more than just identifying where the brush is?
Certainly. So around 2008 or so, we started noticing that bills targeting the teaching of evolution um, started to have a laundry list of topics that were supposedly controversial. And these often went biological evolution, origin of life, global warming, human cloning. And we weren't quite sure what was going on with that,
Hmm.
whether the idea was just to disguise the fact that evolution was being invidiously singled out, or whether the sponsors of these bills really cared about all of those topics or what was going on. And we began to ask around. We go to other nonprofit organizations in the same policy sphere and say, hey, who does for climate change what NCSC does for evolution? And everybody said, well, we don't know of anybody like that. So we thought about that for a while and conducted the first national survey of public school science educators about what they thought and what they taught about climate change. So we
And
basically
this
made this commitment to
across the
adding,
nation.
indeed,
Uh,
made this commitment to defending the teaching of climate change, just as we had previously been committed to defending the teaching of evolution. And we've kept pretty busy on that score ever since.
I see. And do people periodically come knocking on your door? It's like adopting kittens, right? I mean, you take one and now you're the guy who adopts kittens. So people start knocking on your door. They found this kitten. So are people knocking on your door with, hey, we've noticed that there's this uptick in efforts to eliminate this or add this to the curriculum. How about taking that on as well? Is that
We do get that. Both because we're a small nonprofit and because we want to remain focused on what we do best,
Mhm.
we typically turn those knockers away.
Yeah,
So I think
yeah.
the most frequently asked topic we get asked to take on is vaccination.
Ah, but that's right.
But there's people are certainly right to be worried about attacks on
Sure.
the teaching of vaccination and vaccination practices in public schools.
Right.
Uh, we don't consider that within our sphere of
Right.
activity.
Right. So could you talk some about what the NCSE does generally, no, specifically, and what it's focused on now, and what it's finding about what it's focused on now, the how climate is taught, and then I'd like to drill down on some of those kinds of particular questions, but how How are we doing?
Well, it's very hard to know how we're doing. And the reason for that is education in the United States is extremely decentralized,
Yes.
with most of the decisions about curriculum instruction being made at the level of the local school district. And there are about 13,500 school districts in the US. And they don't really report what they're doing to any
Mm,
central authority, not even their state, let alone nationally. So if you want to know what's going on, you have to do fairly systematic survey research. And NCSE is now committed to doing this periodically. We've done 2 national surveys of science educators and plan to do a third later this year.
quite
Uh,
specifically about climate, how climate is taught, how climate change, or generally.
well, it's valuable to have cross-sectional data. So we're building on the work of 2 political scientists at Penn State University, Eric Plutzer and Michael Berkman, who conducted not really the first national survey of high school biology teachers, but the first one since the 1930s.
Oh, well.
And they conducted this in 2007. And it was Eric Plutzer who we later recruited to do our climate change survey in 2014, 2015. And we worked again with Plutzer to do a partial replication of both um, in 2019.
Well, is there something to be alarmed about? I mean, there's in the investigation of this, uh, and I get that it's decentralized, and that means it's potentially, and I suspect in actuality, it varies greatly from place to place, probably from school district to school district, and perhaps even from classroom to classroom. But for my edification and anybody who's listening, so there is no national curriculum. Curriculum choices are made by states, correct?
Curriculum choices are actually made by local school
By
districts.
school districts. So are
Uh,
there state guidelines?
there are state guidelines, and they're called state science standards.
Right.
State science standards lay forth in fairly general and abstract terms what kinds of knowledge and abilities students are expected to acquire through the course of their science education. Then, when districts or schools or teachers develop their curricula, they consult the standards to make sure that their curricula, if followed, will give the students the knowledge and abilities specified in the standards.
And why is that? Why do they do that if the curriculum choices are made at the districts? Are those are those state standards a mandate?
They are a mandate in some sense. They do establish a system of expectations. They're not a mandate in the sense that anyone's going to get punished
Right,
for not
right.
living up to them exactly. But there are certainly incentives built into the system. For
Mm-hmm.
example, states have statewide testing, and the content of statewide testing is based on the content of the state standards.
Mm-hmm.
So if you in your local school district don't prepare a curriculum that gives the students the knowledge and abilities they need to do well in the statewide testing, then your school's going to look bad in the statewide testing, and there are going to
Right,
be repercussions from that.
right. I see. And but there's no. Well, this is a question you'll know better than almost anybody else. But so from state to state, are there wildly different standards, or um, is there some sort of overarching, if not mandate, but clearinghouse of standards? We suggest these, and states take a look at those and derive from that, or can it vary dramatically from state to state?
So states began to start having state science standards in the early 90s as part of the push to outcome-based education. Outcome-based education.
Yeah.
And then we're started to be, in effect, required to have standards by the federal government with the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. So through this period, it pretty much was the Wild West out there with a
Mm.
lot of variance among states. and especially with regard to socially controversial issues like evolution. A consortium of 26 states and a variety of nonprofit educational organizations got together and produced something called the Next Generation Science Standards, NGSS, which were released in 2013.
Hmm.
And NGSS was intended as a model set of state science standards, and the 26 states called the lead state partners had agreed to give serious consideration to adopting them as their state science standards. So since the NGSS were released in 2013, 20 states plus the District of Columbia have adopted them. Another, I think it's 25 states have not adopted NGSS, but have adopted standards based on the same framework that NGSS are based on. So they kind of have cousin standards. And these cousin standards vary dramatically. Uh, they vary dramatically with regard to socially controversial issues like evolution and climate change. So some states that have these cousin standards have somewhat better treatments of evolution and climate change than NGSS. I'd say Massachusetts and New York do,
Hmm.
but many states have worse with regard to evolution and or climate change. And in some cases, there's a reason to think that the states adopted their own cousin standards rather than NGSS precisely because there was concern that NGSS uh, included evolution and climate
Hmm.
change.
So are there any standouts? Are there any that are worth noting in particular?
Well, so what's really worth noting is the states that have adopted neither NGSS nor cousins thereof. And there are only 5 of those left, I believe, if I'm counting right. But they include some of the largest states in the country, Texas, Florida, and Ohio among them.
Hmm.
And
And would you say that no, sorry, NCSE's efforts in those states differ from, in other words, does NCSE sort of drill down to those more problematic states? Do you all play a role in trying to push in the direction of adopting better standards at the state level, or?
we certainly encourage people in states to lobby for improvements to state science standards. They have their chance periodically because states are required to periodically review and revise their state science standards, as
Right.
all their state education standards. And most states have a schedule for this because they don't want to overburden their departments of education by doing
Sure.
all of them at once.
Right.
So maybe every 5 years, every 6 years, every seven
Right.
years.
Yeah.
Uh, that means that we do have recurring battles, and especially in the states that have their own homebrew standards like Texas and Florida and Ohio. Texas is particularly apt to have public controversies about this because they have an elected state board of education that has been historically very willing to tamper with standards to weaken the treatment of evolution and climate change, and also to turn around and use those weakened standards to insist on changes in textbooks submitted for state adoption. And because Texas is the largest textbook market in the country, um, publishers have a strong incentive to pay a lot of attention to changes
Hmm.
demanded by the State Board of Education there.
Hmm. Yeah. And you said you encourage people to lobby. So NCSE does not in itself lobby. Is that true?
Well, it depends. In general, we think it's more effective for local people to be lobbying their
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
but occasionally we will be called upon to lobby, and
Hmm.
sometimes we will answer that call. About 10 years ago, we sent a couple of staffers to Austin to speak before the State Board of Education there,
Mm.
but that's fairly rare.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. So, yeah. Well, Um, let's see. Before I push more on in the what should keep us up at night conversation, the I'm curious about how NCSE or how you did you all, not you particularly, but you all make decisions um, about the science to teach. So I'm going to demonstrate my bias and just to say that from my point of view, the evolution question has been settled for years, right? I mean, the um, the climate questions, although there is certainly agreement, what seems to be certainly widespread agreement that human activity is is having an effect on our climate. Um, it's not uniform. There are some things that are vague. There are some things that scientists seem to have low confidence in because it's such a complex system. The modeling is so challenging, et cetera, et cetera. So how does the NCSE kind of come to assess what 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 the science teachers ought to be, or the districts, et cetera, ought to be teaching about that?
Well,
Do you have to take positions on sort of unsettled science? Or
yeah, it's not really much of an issue because what is taught in secondary science, which is where we concentrate most of our efforts, so middle school and high school,
yeah.
is going to be pretty much uncontroversial science, where there's a large, even overwhelming consensus among the relevant scientific experts. Certainly, teachers can talk about things that are more on the fringes where there is substantial uncertainty, but as long as it's appropriately portrayed, that's no problem. But the kinds of material that gets into textbooks, state science standards, teacher professional development
Mm-hmm.
is usually not on the borderlines. It's going to be clear-cut cases of accepted current science.
Got it. Does NCSE get a lot of pushback itself? Get a lot of pushback in what it does, especially if it shows up, or the? I know there are resources for teachers out there. I mean, do you all, get those irate phone calls in the middle of the night? How dare you?
Yes, we'll get the occasional bit of hate mail. We have a file folder of crank mail and the like, uh, me- irate messages and phone calls and emails. Um,
Which you pull out at holiday parties and and do
I
dramatic readings?
can't deny it, which we pretty much take in stride. We have not had a lot of credible threats of violence.
Interesting. So who is it that puts together? I mean, there are employees or volunteers who from NCSE that put together curriculum and provide or shape resources or make resources available for.
Right. So that's the task of our teacher support team. And what they've been doing is not putting together random curricula on any topic that happens to interest them. They're focused on our core issues of evolution, climate change, and the
Right.
nature of science. And they're using a particular approach, which is sometimes called misconception-based learning. And the idea here is to recognize that students are likely to bring to the classroom with them various kinds of misconceptions that stand in the way of their understanding the subject matter. Some of the misconceptions come from disinformation, that is, misinformation intentionally put about by, as it might be, creationists or climate change
Right.
deniers.
So, and is that still an issue, the creationist issue, or has that been sort of? It seems like that's faded in discourse, in public discourse. But is it still out there in a vigorous way, and we just don't hear much about it?
It's still definitely out there, and if you look in the right places, you'll see that it's going strong. There's a young Earth creationist ministry called Answers in Genesis that has two multi-million-dollar edifices in northern Kentucky. One called the Creation Museum, the other called Ark Encounter.
Wow.
They get a lot of headlines in the local press and a lot of attention from the evangelical press nationally and internationally, for example.
I'm assuming that the NCSE um, is not taking a position about religion or religious beliefs, but that it's responding to the effort of individuals to call creationism, creation science a science, and have it in the curriculum in the appropriate courses, whether it's biology or middle school science, life science classes. Is that am I correct in that?
That's correct. NCSC is a religiously neutral group. Our members, board of directors, and staff have a variety of opinions on religious matters. What unites us is the conviction that evolution needs to be taught as the well-supported and unrivaled unifying principle of science that it is.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah. That's what I imagined. Um, but there are so when you said if you look in the right places, you'll find things. So in those places, those right places, are people still pushing this ought to be this ought to be understood as a science, as an alternative scientific theory?
Certainly. So in 2021, for example, a
Yeah.
legislator in Arkansas introduced a bill that would have allowed teachers in Arkansas public schools to present creationism in their classes. And this bill, though it would be unconstitutional given all the case law, nonetheless passed the House before dying on the narrowest possible margin, 3-3, in the Senate Education Committee there in Arkansas.
Hmm.
2022 was a fiscal session, so the sponsor couldn't reintroduce it that year, but I'm keeping a very wary eye now that they're having a regular session in the Arkansas State House.
It would give, so say this again, it would that the way it was presented, it would give permission for teachers to teach it as a scientific theory. It would not, or were they proposing that it must be taught? Yeah.
It was permissive, so it wouldn't require the teaching of creationism. I think implicitly as a science, as scientifically credible. In fact, the text of the bill said as a theory of how the earth was formed, which is not actually a recognizable description of creationism,
Right.
to creationist or non-creationist alike,
Right.
but the intent is fairly clear, even if
Yeah.
the choice of words was unfortunate.
Yeah. And is there something in, where did you say that was? Was it Arkansas? Is there
Arkansas.
something stated in the law in Arkansas that at the moment that can't be read, that if a teacher brings it up in his or her class, their class, um, uh, that's a violation of something?
I don't know what the Arkansas state law is like, but it would be prohibited under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Right. And there would be challenges from the population about that. Right. But, well, to teach it
As scientifically credible.
as scientifically credible. But yes, it could come up certainly in a religion class if there was such a thing. And yeah, okay,
Or a history class could
sure,
explain, for example, in discussing the Scopes trial.
right,
The problem comes when a teacher says creationism is a scientifically credible view because creationism is fundamentally a religious doctrine.
right.
And to say that it's scientifically credible is to endorse a religious doctrine. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that an agent of the government is forbidden to do.
Right. It's interesting, the connection between creationism and climate science denial, or creationism and climate science denial. You know, they're different in certain ways. Assaults on evolution have long been about religion, really, right? I mean that, and um, and I imagine I think I've bumped into assaults on climate science as that are religion based or in some way. Um, but there's also a bunch of them that are political and have seem to have nothing to do with religion. And I'm wondering if that's causing. I mean, it presents a different puzzle for NCSE, right? I mean, so is there a different strategy that NCSE has to use for those things, or what?
We have not, in fact, seen any litigation over climate change education thus far. So I don't know how
That's
the theory
interesting.
of the case, I don't know how the theory of the
Yeah,
case would go.
but that's interesting. You've not seen any litigation about climate change teaching in classes.
Yeah, I'm
That's
not aware of any.
that's interesting. I would have expected that. That's very surprising to me that it has yet to happen. And my my paranoia says it's just down the road.
Cases, you need some kind of legal theory
Yes.
about why this is something that a court should be adjudicating
Yeah.
as opposed
Yeah.
to the local school district or the state
Or
board
the
of
state board of
education making a
education.
decision
Right.
on.
Right. Right.
And just so far, nobody has
Yeah.
stepped up to the plate on either side. So
And yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I think from the point of view of making all your jobs interesting, I hope that happens. And at the same time, I hope it doesn't happen. But I want to go back to that. I want to go back to the question about how are we doing and what, if anything, keeps people in NCSE, you or others, at night, and what should be keeping us up at night about.
well, so because we're getting data on um, what science teachers are doing over time, we can actually look at some trend lines. And with respect to evolution, the trend lines are rather encouraging. In the 2007 survey that Berkman and Plutzer did,
Mhm.
they found that 51% of high school biology teachers reported that they were emphasizing that evolution was an unrivaled principle of science, and they weren't emphasizing any kind of scientific credibility to creationism. That's the result we want to see. And we had a bare majority in 2007 of high school biology teachers saying that they were evolution friendly in this way. When we repeated that in 2019 in the survey that Eric Plutzer did with NCSC, that
Mhm.
number was up to 67%, over two-thirds.
Yes.
And that's one measure of success and a fairly central one because we want high school biology teachers to be stressing that evolution works and not to be stressing that creationism
Right.
also works.
And are there results in the survey? Well, I guess the survey is what science. The survey was about what science teachers are doing. Is there a sort of a cousin, a related aspect to it, where and what the public is doing about that? So, are there more assaults, fewer assaults on
Well,
the, or is that data we just don't know?
that would be data we don't know. And again, it goes back to the decentralization of American
Yeah,
education. You
yeah.
can't keep your eyes on 13,500 school districts to see what kind of assaults there are. A
Okay.
fair amount of NCSC's work involves, in fact, kind of one-on-one interactions with people facing challenges to science education at a hyper-local level in a particular classroom. So
Really?
a teacher who is being harassed by a parent, or conversely, a parent who is concerned about what a teacher is doing. And these people, they don't want to wake up and find their names in headlines. They want the right outcome, but they don't, want to
Yeah.
be thrust into the spotlight.
So do they literally? I mean, well, I don't, knock on the door, ring the phone, get on the keyboard, and they reach out to, and somebody reaches out to NCSE and says, "Hey, I have a problem. Can you help?"
Exactly.
Really? That's an amazing service.
That's our bread and butter. We do a fair amount of it.
Really?
And and in general, we understand that people don't want these problems to go public. We won't push them to go public if they can't cope with that. But fortunately, we can usually get these problems resolved.
So, do you have
Um,
any stories about that without naming names?
yeah, so we heard from a married couple who had moved from the Midwest to the Deep South and found that their child's uh, middle school science teacher was presenting educational materials that came from a creationist ministry in the science class. So we were able to provide the parents with a lot of information. We looked up the state science standards for middle school science
Mhm.
and compared them with the creationist material, and were able very easily to make the case that presenting the creationist material would impede the students being able to learn the material that the standards uh, wanted them to learn.
Mhm.
We looked in the policy manual for the school district and identified several policies that the teacher must have been in violation of. For example, teachers in that district are supposed to get permission from the principal in advance for using any supplementary materials. So, armed with all of this, the teachers were able to go into the principal's office and explain their concerns. And at our coaching, they took notes of what was going on because you never know when contemporaneous notes are going to be handy. And they got home and found a message from the principal saying, thanks. We
Wow.
have instructed the teacher not to use these materials anymore.
Wow. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's actually, I mean, that is not, maybe I missed that section on the website, but that is not an obvious piece of what NCSE does, and it seems like a wonderful resource. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, on the teacher side, we do strive to make sure that science teachers are aware of NCSC and know what kinds of services, including this
Yeah.
bespoke consultation,
Yeah.
we provide. For parents, it's much harder
Much harder. Yeah.
because there's not an obvious constituency of science-friendly parents that one could reach out to.
Right. Are there any issues? Are there any issues on the horizon that that you all are keeping your eyes on that are not evolution and not creation science? I mean, sorry, not climate science.
Not really. Certainly, there's been a lot of pressure on history and social studies, and as always, health teachers recently. But
But
these
that's
are
not
out of our
you.
sphere of activity.
Yeah, yeah. Does it feel like it's that science education in the territory that you all cover, which is to say the United, I'm assuming it's just the United States, that science education is relatively healthy and vibrant and on target, or 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 otherwise?
Well, it's a mixed picture. With regard to evolution, we have evidence that evolution education is increasing in quantity. The number of average hours in a high school biology class devoted to evolution has gone up. The amount devoted to human evolution almost doubled between 2007 and 2019. Um, with regard to climate change, it's improving, but that's starting from a very low baseline. For historical reasons, earth sciences have been comparatively neglected in American education, going back to decisions made around the time of the Great War that what college-bound high school students really needed to study was biology, chemistry, and physics in that
Mm-hmm.
order,
Mm-hmm.
to the neglect of disciplines like earth science, where, as we now know, would be the most natural place to discuss global warming
Right.
and climate change.
Yes, it's really actually interesting that so for years I was an educator, right? I'm a teacher and an administrator, et cetera. And and earth and space sciences were the classes that schools kind of kept over here for for students who needed another science class because they had plans for college, but seemingly were not prepared for those other, right? They weren't prepared for physics, or they shouldn't have gone. And so it was almost like dealt with as a filler rather than a robust science, which it is, obviously. So, yeah.
And uh, and that continues. In about 30 states, in order to graduate from high school, you have to have taken a biology class in high school. That's true for earth sciences classes in only one or two states.
Yeah, that fits what my experience in the world. Yeah, yeah, which is a shame. So where do they teach it in biology? Where do they teach climate science?
So there are certainly places you can teach about climate change in a biology class where you talk about how species react to climate change, usually going north or climbing up mountains.
Yeah.
Um, you can talk about ocean acidification in a chemistry class. You can
Mm,
talk about how greenhouse gases affect the incoming and outgoing radiation on Earth in a
right,
physics class.
right,
But if you want a class where you really put all the pieces together, that's going to be an earth sciences class or an environmental studies class or
right.
a class that deals with earth systems in some way or other.
Mhm.
And these are unfortunately somewhat far and few between
Yeah,
in
that's interesting.
US science education.
Hmm.
One thing that we're interested in, as I mentioned when I was discussing our upcoming survey, is what's taught about the nature of science and a kind of related issue, trust in science.
And is that a new exploration for the NCSE, or do you have something to report about about that attitude in the past as well?
Well, nature of science has always been kind of in the background for us because when we were dealing exclusively with the teaching of evolution, a lot of the misconceptions surrounding evolution are really misconceptions about what kind of beast science is.
Yes.
So, one very common misconception about science is that it's an all or nothing affair, that science either gives you certainties or it gives you nothing.
Hmm.
Whereas, in fact, in science, there's a continuum of levels of confidence from confident not to confident so, but every stage in between. And you can be perfectly well justified in accepting a scientific conclusion without it being ironclad certain.
Right. Right.
And often, of course, creationists will invoke this
That's a
misconception.
wedge. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes rather unscrupulously. So, for example, you'll see creationists who will criticize scientists who say, well, probably this, it's likely that that, say, well, you're not certain, you don't know. But
It's a
we'll turn
theory.
around
It's
and
just a
look at a
theory.
passage in which there aren't such qualifiers and say, well, you're being dogmatic.
Yes. Right.
So heads I win, tails you
Yes.
lose.
Exactly.
So, but but
Well,
partly
okay.
because of interest among science educators and people studying science education policy, we're now interested in looking at the nature of science kind of as such, what teachers think about it, what they teach about it, and what they think and teach about trust in science, especially with the pandemic still on everyone's minds.
Hmm.
The question of under what circumstances is it reasonable and or unreasonable to trust in science as a community of inquirers
Hmm.
has a certain desperate relevance these
Right.
days, and we'd
It,
like to investigate that.
I think that's that. Well, you've given me something else to worry about at night. To keep me up all night is that's true. It's happening on many fronts, right? So, absent an understanding of science, or a mistrust in the a mistrust or a misguided understanding of the nature of science and how it proceeds and how it assesses evidence is certainly something relevant in science, but it overlaps tremendously with sort of the assault on, for lack of a better term, Enlightenment values, the value of thinking clearly, the value of rational thought, the value of critical thought, of critical thinking, and the overlaps there in the humanities and the history classes and social sciences, et cetera, and sciences. And I think I don't even think there's a doubt that there is what feels like an assault on the value of those ways of approaching unknowns, right? And so
And would
that'll
certainly be
keep you up.
pleased. We'd certainly be pleased at NCSC if our results on science education and nature of science and science education inform broader efforts outside science education to promote critical thinking and the
Yeah,
scientific attitude.
yeah. Other than the coming survey of how things are there other things on the horizon that NC is sort of working towards, looking towards, that people can?
Well, the teacher support team continues to develop and test uh, model lesson sets on evolution, climate change, and the nature of science, and these are freely available. We are looking to expand and have districts have us come in to conduct professional development
Oh, that's interesting.
workshops. So any of your listeners who happen to be interested in
Yeah.
professional development for their local teachers should get in touch with
So
NCSC
this
to see
is,
what we can
oh,
arrange.
that's amazing. That's a great resource. That's a great resource.
Well, you actually did ask a question earlier that we kind of didn't answer because we kind of drifted off, but you were kind of pondering the different motivations between these two forms of science denial,
Yes.
evolution denial or creationism, and climate change denial.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it does look like the primary motivations are different. In the case of creationism, it's a religious doctrine, typically biblical inerrantism, the idea that the Bible is without error in all it teaches with regard to history and science, not only with regard to faith and morals. Whereas in the case of climate change, it seems that the underlying attitude is suspicion of or hostility toward government.
Yes. I think that's
With
true.
the reasoning kind of going backwards, government regulation and international cooperation are going to be necessary to deal with climate change. I don't like those things, therefore there's no climate change.
Right. Right.
But even though you do have these two different attitudes at work, there is some substantial overlap between creationists and climate change deniers. You can tell that going on a case-by-case basis. So if you look at any of the main creationist websites, you'll see a fair amount of climate science denial in the mix. If you
Really?
look, and some of the more vocal climate change deniers are creationists or have ties to creationist organizations. If you look at the polling numbers, you also see that a lot of creationists are climate deniers and vice versa. But on the third hand, this seems to be a historical contingency. So a recent book by a historian named Neil Pogue at the University of Texas, Dallas, discusses in some detail how even among evangelical Christians back in the 1970s, there was a lot of expressed concern for the environment, not necessarily taking the form of accepting climate change because that was on the horizon. Uh, even among some what we would consider kind of retrograde thinkers like Francis Schaeffer. But the American evangelical community become set against climate change around in the early 1990s. And if I had to put it in a sentence, this is the result of evangelical Christianity being engulfed by the Republican Party in the 1960s, and then the Republican Party being engulfed by big oil in the 1990s. So what happens is that even though there's really nothing about evangelical Christianity intrinsically that predisposes it to climate change
Right.
denial,
Right.
the fact of this kind of these political captures means that evangelical Christian authorities were being told by big oil climate change is a hoax, and they passed that on to their followers.
Mm-hmm.
A sociologist named Robin Globus Veldman, in a book that came out a couple of years ago, had a very elegant demonstration of this. She had spent a lot of time with evangelicals in the Southeast and also with Seventh-day Adventists in the same area. Now, Seventh-day Adventists have a lot of theological differences. They come from the Millerite tradition. They respect Ellen Gould White as a prophetess.
Mm-hmm.
They have their day of rest on Saturday instead of Sunday. But they're kind of demographically and sociologically a lot like evangelicals. And Veltman found that her evangelicals bought into climate change denial, but the Seventh-day Adventists didn't.
And why?
And the reason for that just seemed to be because the Seventh-day Adventists had their own authorities that they looked to, who hadn't been co-opted by big oil, essentially,
Hmm.
by way of the
Yeah.
Republican Party. Um, Climate change deniers where the source of their denial is by way of their religious community. It helps to keep in mind that that connection is a contingent one. It was made at some point, so it can be broken.
Yes.
And pointing out that there is this history of evangelical concern for the environment, pointing out that there are contemporary evangelicals who recognize the reality of climate change and are concerned about it, particularly Catherine Hayhoe, who is a evangelical, who is a climate scientist at Texas Tech and a
Hmm.
marvelous communicator, especially with her co-religionists, citing the existence of respectable evangelical opinion that accepts the reality of climate change and is willing to face the necessity for climate action
Mm-hmm.
can be very helpful.
Yeah.
I think that everybody fundamentally wants today's students to have the best available science education. It's just some people are confused about what that means.
Uh, that's it's a very generous outlook. I hope you're right. I know that I have met people, probably more so in recent years than past years, perhaps because of where I'm living now. But I know I've met people who, and maybe because of the pandemic, who express an enormous distrust of science and scientists and people resting weight on the value of 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 careful science to draw conclusions. Um, maybe because of all of the to do about the vaccines. Um, uh, Maybe because of religious fundamentalism. Um, and maybe because there are so many social issues at the moment that have that if they are not primarily scientific issues of science, science certainly has its tentacles in those issues. Everything from pronouns, gender, to sexuality, to just keep naming them, to social issues of all sorts. And so I'm hoping that that you're correct, that everyone wants kids to have the best science education they can get. The problem of mistrust in science, I would lay some of the blame for that problem at the feet of science teachers for years past, right? I mean, and maybe still, that so much of what studying science was really not doing science, not even really deeply understanding science, but reading really was history. It was like reading what scientists said, right? And scientists found this, and scientists found that, and scientists found this, and memorize those names, and okay, you did fine, and not digging deeply into how scientists necessarily came to those conclusions, and how they drew those conclusions, and where the sort of soft spots were, right? And what was still in question. And I think it's that's unfortunate, because I don't think science education, especially K through 12 science education, often leaves people with a deep appreciation for what scientists actually do. Right?
And one of the strengths of the next generation science standards was that they are based in a method called inquiry-based learning.
Yes.
With the intention that students will be guided to think as scientists think and do what scientists do when they're doing science.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a goal.
Yes.
It does require a lot more of science teachers. It requires them to learn how to teach in a new way. And not all states have done equally good jobs in preparing their teachers,
right.
And not all colleges of education in preparing their pre-service teachers
right.
to live up to these heightened demands. But it certainly seems like a praiseworthy goal, and we hope to see it be better and more widely implemented in the future.
Mm-hmm. That seems like a very important piece. Well, that may be a good place to stop, sort of with hopes and dreams of a future. And I really thank you for your time, and for the work you do, and for that NCSE does. I think it's a really great, and now I know even more about what you do, which I think it's really a wonderful resource. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.